There are commanders who win when everything goes according to plan. And then there are the ones they call when the plan is already on fire. Georgy Zhukov was the second type. He had no formal military academy education, just cavalry courses, World War I, the Russian Civil War, and a lifetime of bruises and chain-smoked cigarettes. He didn't think by the book. He thought by the situation. He hated politics and demanded that military men be given full freedom to do their jobs. And that's exactly why, whenever the front was collapsing and generals were losing contact with their troops, Stalin picked up the phone and said, "Get there, Zhukov, sort it out." Today, we're not going to rehash school textbooks. We're breaking down 3 operations where Zhukov put everything on the line: his career, the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and basically the fate of the country. And he won against all logic, the kind of logic they teach in academies. Let's start where the Kremlin first heard about Zhukov as a guy who could think outside the box. Summer 1939, the border between Mongolia and the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo. The Japanese 23rd Division had seized the high ground along the Khalkhin Gol River. For weeks, Soviet forces had been throwing themselves into frontal assaults, getting slaughtered, getting nowhere. Local commanders had dug in and, honestly, already made peace with the positional meat grinder. Zhukov arrived in May 1939. The first thing he did? He personally flew a reconnaissance mission in a flimsy U-2 biplane. He got shot down, crashed, survived, and the next day he was back in the air. Only after that did he gather the commanders and say something worth burning into your brain. We don't need defense, we need total annihilation of the enemy. No retreat. Not one. The local commanders who suggested digging in and waiting for reinforcements, Zhukov sidelined them immediately. A coded message went to Moscow. The situation demands unified command. Request full authority. Now a quick technical detour. His main striking force was the BT-7 tank, a controversial machine. On one hand, it could do 70 kilometers per hour on a highway. Insane for 1939. On the other hand, its armor was only 13 to 22 millimeters thick. A heavy machine gun could punch through it. The engine ran on gasoline, a rolling fire hazard. Later, German 37mm guns would shred these things like tin cans from 500 meters. But in 1939, the Japanese didn't have many of those. Their main anti-tank weapon was Molotov cocktails and gasoline bombs. So the BT-7 was perfect for Khalkhin Gol. Fast, mobile, able to march 200 to 300 kilometers without stopping. But one thing is having tanks, another is moving them into position without being seen. And here's where Zhukov pulled a move that's still studied in war colleges. He ordered operational maskirovka, deception on an industrial scale. Special sound rigs, some captured German, some Soviet-made, played recordings of tractors, jackhammers, winches, and planes all night long. The Japanese listened, logged everything, reported to Tokyo. The Russians are preparing for a long winter, building permanent bases. They won't move until spring. They relaxed, and 2 weeks later, August 20th, 1939, they got hit with a Blitzkrieg that even German generals would later call textbook. At 5:45 a.m., 150 SB bombers and hundreds of I-16 fighters flattened Japanese positions. For the first hour and a half, the Japanese couldn't even return fire. Communications were gone, HQs were rubble. Then the tank brigades rolled into the breach. 2 pincers, north and south, moving toward each other at 40 kilometers a day. This was the first encirclement in history carried out entirely by mechanized forces, no cavalry support. By the evening of August 26th, the Japanese 23rd Division was trapped. But here's the thing. Even after that, the Japanese didn't surrender. Zhukov later wrote about interrogating prisoners near the Khalkhin Gol River. Japanese soldiers had been sitting in reeds, under orders not to move. Mosquitoes ate them alive. They swallowed mud. They passed out from hunger. But they kept sitting there in silence because the order was to not give away their positions. Zhukov said, "Like it or not, you have to respect them." That's not propaganda. That's a professional acknowledging a serious enemy he just destroyed. The result? Japan lost 61,000 killed, wounded, and captured. Soviet losses, 18,500. But the political outcome was even bigger. On September 15, 1939, exactly 2 weeks after World War II started in Europe, Japan signed a neutrality pact with the USSR. They turned south. Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the colonies, no attack on the Soviet Far East. And that decision, forced by Zhukov's strike, freed up 40 divisions. 40 divisions that were rushed west to Moscow in December 1941. If Zhukov hadn't taken that risk, if he'd just dug in and waited, there might have been no Battle of Moscow. The Japanese would have stabbed the USSR in the back at the worst possible moment. Now let's jump to 1942. The situation in the South is a disaster, worse than 41. Paulus's Sixth Army has sunk its teeth into Stalingrad. The city named after Stalin is in ruins, but the Germans are taking block after block. On October 9, 1942, Hitler declares, "Stalingrad has fallen. The Russians are broken." The reality? The 62nd Army is holding on by a thread and the last few rounds of ammo. The Volga crossing is under fire. Every supply boat is a suicide run. Mid-September, the Kremlin. Stalin calls in Zhukov and Chief of Staff Vasilevsky. One question: what do we do? Stalin's demand: save the city at any cost. Throw in reserves, frontal assaults, blow the Germans off the factory floors. According to Zhukov's memoirs, he and Vasilevsky asked for 5 minutes in the next room, something almost too dangerous to say out loud. What if instead of frontal assaults that will certainly chew up divisions in a meat grinder, we hit the flanks, where the Germans are covered by Romanians and Hungarians? Why was this brilliant? Because by October 1942, the German army is still the best in the world. They know how to fight. They have communications, combined arms coordination, officers with experience from France and the first year of the Eastern Front. But they have an Achilles heel. Hitler, drunk on his own strategic genius, has stretched the front over thousands of kilometers. The Germans simply don't have enough men to cover the flanks of their striking forces. So those flanks were given to the Romanians and Hungarians. And the Romanian army in 1942? Not elite. Outdated 37mm guns that can't penetrate a T-34. No short-range anti-tank weapons. Low morale because Romanian soldiers didn't understand why they were fighting in Russia. And most importantly, they had no idea how to build a deep, layered defense. Zhukov personally went to the front line in a private's uniform to check if Soviet positions were visible from the German side. This isn't a metaphor. He put on an overcoat with no rank insignia, crossed the front line, lay down in the snow, looked through binoculars, crawled into no man's land to see if tank movements could be spotted. Then he came back and adjusted troop positions. Operation Uranus was prepared under extreme secrecy. Troop movements happened only at night. Tanks were camouflaged as haystacks. Radio traffic was faked to sound routine. Dummy formations with their own radio nets were set up near Moscow to make German intelligence think the main Soviet offensive was aimed at Army Group Center. Not a single German reconnaissance plane spotted the 500,000-strong force massing in the steppe, 200 kilometers from the city. Zhukov amassed 11 armies, about 13,500 artillery pieces and mortars, 900 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft, all without the Germans being any the wiser. November 19, 1942, 7:30 a.m., minus 18 degrees Celsius, foggy. The Southwestern Front opens artillery preparation, 3,500 guns and mortars. The strike was so brutal that Romanian soldiers who survived it had ruptured eardrums and years of psychological trauma. One German officer with the 13th Romanian Infantry Division reported, "The attack was repulsed. Then a second assault, this time with tanks, was also beaten off." But when the artillery ceased and the Romanians heard the sound of tank engines approaching through the fog, they knew it was over. T-34s crushed barbed wire, collapsed trenches, and rolled over defensive positions. Soviet cavalrymen on their shaggy little Cossack ponies cantered alongside the tanks, submachine guns slung across their backs. The tank corps punched through and covered 120 kilometers in 48 hours, linking up with Stalingrad front forces. On November 23rd at 4 p.m., near the town of Khalkhin Gol, the lead elements of the 4th and 26th Tank Corps met. The ring closed. 22 German divisions, 300,000 men, trapped. Hitler's reaction was hysterical. He forbade Paulus from attempting a breakout, promised to supply the cauldron by air, and ordered them to hold to the last. Reality. The Luftwaffe promised 500 tons of supplies per day. They delivered maybe 100. The men of the 6th Army died from starvation, frostbite, disease. They ate horses, cats, then boiled dead horses a second time just to soften the hide. But Zhukov didn't let them escape. February 1943, surrender. Paulus, who'd been promoted to field marshal the day before, a hint that no German field marshal had ever surrendered, was captured in the basement of a department store. German General Hans Dörr later wrote, "For Germany, the Battle of Stalingrad was the heaviest defeat in its history. For Russia, the greatest victory." But Zhukov didn't rest. Summer 1943, the Kursk salient. Another moment of choice, and once again he goes against the grain. Spring 1943, the front stabilizes. The Germans are preparing Operation Citadel, a pincer movement from north and south to cut off the Soviet armies inside the Kursk Bulge and destroy them. And they have new tanks. The Tiger with 100mm frontal armor, the Panther with 85mm. Our mainstay, the T-34-76, can only penetrate a Tiger from 300 meters, and only from the side. The Tiger can kill us from 1,500 meters. A massive technical advantage. The Germans are confident Citadel will break the Red Army's back. Inside the Soviet High Command, a fierce argument breaks out. Front commanders Vatutin and Konyev, brilliant generals in their own right, are shouting, "We need to attack first! Don't let the Germans gather their forces! A preemptive strike!" Their logic makes sense. If we hit them first, we disrupt their offensive, force them to retreat, make them attack from unprepared positions. Zhukov writes a memo to Stalin. A memo where he says straight up, "We must exhaust the enemy in defense. Let them strike first. Let their Tigers run into our minefields. Let them burn fuel, ammo, men. And when they're spent, we throw everything we have at them." This was insane. Zhukov was essentially proposing to let a technically superior enemy land the first punch, to let them choose the time, the place, the direction, and to have the sheer nerve to believe his army would hold. Stalin hesitated for days. It's in the diaries, the memoirs. He asked again and again, demanded guarantees. Zhukov didn't give guarantees. He gave calculations, and Stalin, who generally hated being challenged, approved Zhukov's plan. Preparations for the defense of the Kursk salient were unprecedented. Minefield density reached 1,500 anti-tank and 1,700 anti-personnel mines per kilometer of front. That means a German tank advancing would hit a mine every 50 to 70 meters on average. Artillery was arranged in packets, not in a single line, but in a checkerboard pattern layered 30 kilometers deep. Every gun knew its sector. If a German column got past the first line, it got shredded from the flanks on the second. If it got past the second, the third. And no retreat. Zhukov's order? Stand and die. Not one step back. The Germans attacked on July 5, 1943, at 5:30 a.m. But Soviet artillery beat them by 10 minutes. A deserter from the German side gave away the exact time, and Zhukov ordered a preemptive counter-preparation. The first German attack stalled. Tigers blew up on mines, got hit by hidden guns, burned, but the Germans brought up reserves. On the northern face, Army Group Center pushed 10 to 12 kilometers. On the southern face, Army Group South under Manstein, one of the Wehrmacht's best strategists, pushed 35 kilometers. Manstein could already taste victory. And then, on July 12, 1943, Zhukov makes a decision that historians still argue about. He throws his strategic reserve into battle, Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army, 850 tanks and self-propelled guns. Their mission? A meeting engagement with the German 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which included the divisions Leibstandarte, Das Reich, and Totenkopf. But here's something most accounts get wrong. The IISS Panzer Corps never had 500 or 700 tanks at Prokhorovka. On July 11th, the day before the battle, the entire corps had only 211 operational tanks. Totenkopf had 94, Leibstandarte only 56, and Das Reich just 61. Only 15 Tiger tanks were still in action. The numbers game cuts both ways. Soviet losses were also staggering, but the Germans did not break through. On July 13th, Stalin ordered Zhukov to fly to Prokhorovka to coordinate operations of the Voronezh and Steppe fronts. In his memoirs, Zhukov describes a measured meeting between military professionals, but other accounts paint a different picture. General Popel, who was there, wrote that when Zhukov arrived at General Getman's headquarters, the commanders looked on Zhukov with apprehension and hope. With apprehension, for they knew that the rare visit by Zhukov would not be without just and unjust dressings down, dismissals, demotions. Popel added, "The rudeness which many commanders of my generation connect with the name of Marshal Zhukov was not his only self-indulgence. His belief in his right to insult, to humiliate his subordinate was transmitted like an infection." Like many successful commanders, Zhukov did not try to cultivate popularity. He knew that he was required to deliver victory to Stalin, whatever the cost. July 12th was the turning point. Manstein reported to Hitler, "Further offensive is impossible. Losses are irreplaceable." On July 13th, Hitler ordered Citadel to stop. The Wehrmacht's offensive capability on the Eastern Front was broken forever. On August 23rd, Soviet forces liberated Kharkiv, and a little over a year later, Zhukov would sign the German instrument of surrender in Berlin. But that's another story. We also need to talk about what people don't like to mention. Zhukov's victories were not pretty. He spared neither himself nor his soldiers. And this is where he fundamentally differed from Konstantin Rokossovsky, whom soldiers quietly called Dad. Rokossovsky used to say, "You have to save a soldier for the next battle." He conserved lives, looked for ways around, minimized losses where possible. Zhukov operated differently, accomplished the mission at any cost, and sometimes that cost was staggering. During the storming of Berlin, for example, losses reached 300,000 men in 16 days, a colossal number. And Zhukov's critics are right to point this out. Rokossovsky was unfailingly polite to his subordinates, never raised his voice, patiently explained mistakes. Once during a phone call, Zhukov crossed every line, started yelling. Rokossovsky calmly replied, "Georgy Konstantinovich, if you don't change your tone, I'm hanging up." And he did. Zhukov called back and apologized, an incredibly rare occurrence. The command of the Victory Parade in Moscow on June 24, 1945 was given to Rokossovsky, not Zhukov. But it was Zhukov who rode a white horse across Red Square and dangerously provoked Stalin's envy. But here's the question. Who else could have won at Khalkhin Gol? Who else could have convinced Stalin to wait at Kursk when everyone around was demanding an attack? Who else could have decided in December 1941 not to pull back from Moscow, even though the Germans were 30 kilometers from the Kremlin? Stalin had options. He had Timoshenko, a good army commander but not a strategist. He had Budyonny, a hero of the Civil War but a man of the past. He had Voroshilov, who botched the war with Finland in 1939. Zhukov was different. He understood that World War II was not a war of horses and sabers. It was a war of engines, resources, steel, and iron nerves. He understood earlier than anyone else, victory doesn't go to the guy who maneuvers more brilliantly. It goes to the guy who can concentrate every ounce of force into a single point and strike so hard that the enemy ceases to exist as an organized fighting force. He wasn't a saint. He was a crisis manager in an era of total war. A man Stalin feared, respected, suspected, and absolutely could not do without. As one historian put it, Zhukov did not excel as the best ever in any one field of military endeavor, but he was the best all-around general of the Second World War. He combined prowess and courage in battle with ambitious strategic vision, determination, and organizational ability. He inspired the affection and confidence of his troops, as well as their fear, if not the ungrudging respect of all his peers. He was stoic in defeat and exuberant in victory. Zhukov saved the country 3 times. At Khalkhin Gol, by taking the fight out of Japan. At Stalingrad, by turning the tide of the entire war. At the Kursk salient, by burying Hitler's last hope for victory on the Eastern Front. And these are not empty words. They are facts backed by documents, combat reports, orders, and the memoirs of both enemies and allies. Now here's a question for you. Not rhetorical, not just for engagement. Which of these three operations do you think was the most difficult to pull off?
Khalkhin Gol, where Zhukov was still a newcomer, risking his career, basically inventing tactics from scratch. Stalingrad, the grandmaster-level gamble where he went against Stalin's wishes and put everything on the line. Or Kursk, the art of patience, where he convinced everyone to wait and take a punch to the face, knowing that punch would be devastating. Drop your answer in the comments. I'll bet most of you will say Stalingrad, but honestly, I'm going with Kursk. Because attacking first takes courage, but standing your ground under the heaviest blow the enemy can deliver, knowing their tigers and panthers are coming and not breaking, that takes character. That takes steel. That's Zhukov.